Well, good morning, church. It is good to see everybody here today. I know there's some folks who are back after quarantine, and it's good to see them again. It's kind of hard to believe that it's been only a week, really, in my mind, since we lost our friend. But I will say that in these kind of hard times, these times of continual grief and healing, man, it's good to be together. Yesterday was such a healing time for those of us who can make it. Even being today and the regular reflections that have been made so far are healing and helpful. I said this yesterday, but it's actually happening now. It's hard to not see my buddy in the back room. But as I was thinking about that this morning, as I was kind of just mentally preparing for that, it struck me that, man, Omar's worshiping in a much higher capacity than any of us are right now. And he doesn't have the grief that we do. And so we're grateful that he gets to experience what he gets to experience. Well, so today we're going to be continuing on in our Beginnings series, looking at the opening chapters of the Bible and seeing what it has to say about who we are and how we should live. And you'll remember that we're doing this alongside of our young people who are studying the first 25 chapters of Genesis for Bible Bowl and for LTC. We're trying to preach along with what they are studying. And on that note, there is going to be an LTC meeting after services this morning. If you're a parent of anybody from 3rd grade through 12th grade, or if you're in that bracket yourself, just kind of come meet over in this side section after worship. They're going to talk about the sign-ups and the coming plans to get going in LTC as well. But last week we covered, from as Rich mentioned, from creation to chaos, right? We saw who made us, who we are, and why we are here. Of course, we also walked away knowing that the goodness God created us for has been damaged, right? The goodness God created us for has been damaged. But with that said, our blessed identity and our blessed purpose, they didn't change. After the fall, after the goodness of God had formed a few cracks in it, we did not lose being image bearers of God, right? We did not lose that role of being sub-rulers of God's creation with Him and under Him. But even still, the wickedness does seem to beat out the goodness from this point on, especially as you read chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 through Genesis. There's actually this really obscure story in Genesis chapter 4 that isn't talked about very much, but I think it does a really good job expressing the direction that the world is going in. There's a man named Lamech, who the Bible says was very talented with music and with instruments, with poetry and song. But even with that God-given creativity, which last week we said was part of what it means to bear the image of God, right? To be creative, to design and invent and those kind of things. So instead of using that skill for good bearing fruit in the image of God, he uses it to sing and write songs about murdering people and revenge and everything like that, right? And so, that's a little abstract thing, but we see how humanity is going. They're using the gifts God had given them to bless and to glorify God to do quite the opposite. It just goes to show us how even their original identity as image bearers is being twisted to produce wicked fruit. And as we know, things eventually do reach a breaking point, okay? And that's what the story we're going to be looking at this morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip over with me to Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 5. Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 5. And if you're not familiar with that, it's the story of Noah. We're going to be looking at the story of Noah and the flood today. And at first I was thinking about this, and I got kind of excited. I even told Sean in the office this week, I said, this story always gets told in these watered down child book type ways. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna bring out the graphic side of the flood. I'm gonna tell the gross parts. We're gonna bring it to life and let it be the PG-13 version of the story that it really is. And then I thought to myself, oh, it's the fifth Sunday. There's no Kingdom Kids. Never mind. No, well, it's too late now. The notes are written, and I'm not clever enough to go off of what my own thoughts up here, right? But we're still going to take a fresh perspective and know that I did take the time to see, and as I was reading, I think we have this fresh perspective that I think will be helpful for us, as well as cause our minds to continue to seek after God and to seek after His good nature in the story of in Noah. So if you will, let's go ahead and read Genesis chapter 6, 5 through 8. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe away from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this story of Noah and the flood, it covers 4 whole chapters in the Bible, okay? Chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. But as I was preparing for this week, as I started my studies, as I started reading the story over again, it was these opening 4 verses that just captivated me. I had a very hard time moving away from these 4 verses to move on to anything else. As I approached the week, I thought I'd spend most of my time on Noah's faithfulness to obey God's specific commandments or God's goodness to save one righteous man and his family. But instead, I was completely caught up in these 4 verses. Let me just ask, how do we tell this story? How do we hear this story? When we talk about the story of Noah, how is it normally told? I think it normally goes something along these lines. The world became abundantly evil, which is very true, right? I mean, verse 5 up there, right? It says every inclination of the human hearts was evil all the time. That's a lot of, hyperbolic language. It had gotten very, very bad. But also, because of that, God became very angry. And so he punished the world by destroying it in a flood so that all living things, minus the remnant that he saved, would die. That's the way I grew up hearing the story. I think that's the way a lot of the world hears this story. It's about an angry God who punishes the earth for its wickedness. And that's not the story I read in these 4 verses. That's not the story I walked away with this week. I think that story makes God out to be an angry, vengeful tyrant, but Genesis 6, it gives me a much different picture of God. When I read these verses, I don't see an angry tyrant. What I see is a hurting parent. That's what I see. I see a hurting parent. Look at verse 6 especially. It says, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. I think the main motivation here it's not anger. I think it's actually sadness. It's grief at what had become of his good creation. When God created the world and everything in it, he said it was good. He saw in it potential for more goodness as Adam and Eve would multiply, and the animals would multiply, and the garden itself would grow with more goodness. God had plans for good for his creation, where he would bless it, and then it would turn around and praise and worship him back. It was this great future that God would interact with the creation. But now, right? But now the creation had become an arena for all the things that stood against what God was and who God is. It was the complete opposite of what he wanted for it, and he could see the creation and the world as a whole veering off into a direction that, 1, did not include God at all, right? Did not include God at all. And 2, would only lead to further destruction of the creation that God loved. The path that they were going down not only was abandoning the Creator, the Father who had made them, but it was also going down a path that would lead to its ultimate, complete destruction. And that's why I say this looks like a hurting parent to me. Because I think there's a deep connection. One of the things I was reading as I was kind of doing a study, it said there's a heart-to-heart connection, right? In that verse we read that their hearts were evil and God's heart was troubled. In verses 5 and 6, it's a heart-to-heart connection that God has here. And this is, I think, a better way for us to picture God in this specific moment of crisis. And that's what it is. It's more in line with the image of God that we receive in the revelation of Jesus Christ. Because we know that the God from the Old Testament and the God revealed in Jesus Christ is the same, right? And so we need to make sure these two gods fit on the same page. When we try to divorce them into two separate gods, we get into all sorts of trouble. So now I'm not saying there's no anger here either, okay? Jesus definitely shows us moments of righteous indignation in the New Testament as well. But I think by the words from the Bible itself in this passage, in chapter 6, and especially verse 6, we should see grief. We should see sadness as the main expression from God in this passage, the main motivation that brings about the next couple of chapters. There was one translation I ended up reading. It's not even a very loose translation, but it said God was heartbroken. Instead of troubled in his heart, it said he was heartbroken. But, okay, if all this is true, if it is more sadness than anger, if it is more grief than vengefulness, then why the flood, right? Why the flood? that's still a pretty harsh isn't that still a pretty harsh reaction to what is happening in the world right then? Well, I think yes, and I think no. I think a little bit of both. Yes, because it is devastating, right? The loss of life to be had in the flood, that is no small matter. And I don't think God treats it flippantly either. In fact, at the end of the story, we're going to see that God is deeply touched by the flood, almost as much as the sin that caused the flood. But I also think, no, it's not that harsh because, in fact, this is the only way God could go about to save the creation itself, to save the creation. With evil being as pervasive as it had become, it needed a complete renewal to have redemption and to have salvation. It needed this complete renewal of righteousness. God never in the Bible completely destroys and then recreates. We never see that. This is the closest it comes. But we never see God completely destroy and then recreate. But more than once in the Bible, we see people who walk in a path of wickedness and they end up destroying themselves in the process. But every time that happens, Israel is a great example of that. But so many other times that happened, God preserves for himself a faithful remnant that he can redeem and he can continue to work with. God never abandons his people. He never abandons those that he loves. He saves and he works and he redeems and he renews and he grows from them. And Noah is the opportunity for that in this story. Really Noah is the first devout example of a devout faithfulness that we have in the Bible. Maybe Abel, I guess, but in Noah we see someone who is righteous in the face of wickedness and chooses to obey God over and over and over again, especially in the face of persecution, as we imagine he had. And Genesis really wants you to know this. There's multiple references to Noah's faithfulness in just a really small amount of time. The Bible I have here has, the two columns on each page. And all those references right there, which it's not exhaustive, is about this much of the page. Okay? Like they're saying it right after another. They want you to know that Noah was righteous, that Noah obeyed God and obeyed God to a T. I look at Noah and I think to myself, if Noah can do that, if Noah can live that faithful life, then I have no excuses, right? No matter how bad your family might be, if you come from a rough family life, no matter how bad your work environment might be, no matter how bad your school might be, if Noah can remain righteous in a setting like his, I think we can remain faithful in a setting like ours, right? It's tempting to be overwhelmed by the darkness and let it put out our light, but we must remember that sometimes our light might be one of the few remaining in the dark room, okay, like Noah's was, very explicitly. We must remember to let our light shine no matter how dark the room becomes. In fact, the darker the room becomes, the brighter our light can truly be. And so God in Noah sees a seed for a new creation, a fresh start for his image bearers that can lead to the goodness that he always desired. Now, God's not naive, right? He's not naive. He knows the world is still fallen. He knows that sin isn't going to be washed away by these waters in the flood. Bit of allusion to maybe some others that might do that later. But it's a chance for newness and redemption that God decides to give us a chance. Regardless of what we might do with that chance, we didn't do a great job. He decides that he wants to give humanity a chance. And so the story progresses, as each of us has heard over and over again. Odds are, if this is the first time you've ever sat in a church building, you still kind of know the story of Noah well enough. God gives Noah very specific instructions. Noah follows them to a T, which is a good lesson for us. The animals are sent by God to load into the ark. Here's a question. How many of each animal did God send into the ark? 2 by 2. But that's only partially right. Where's my Bible Bowl kids? 7, yeah, of the clean animals. There we go. See, look at our learned congregation. Yeah, for the clean animals, it was 7. For the unclean, it was 2. God secures Noah and his family in the ark. The flood comes, the flood recedes, and then we get this offering by Noah when he walks out of the ark safely for the first time at the end of Genesis chapter 8. It tells us that Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." Then right after that, we read this new commissioning from God that sounds a lot like the original commissioning that God gave Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1. It's covenant language again. In Genesis, just right after that, Genesis chapter 9, verses 1, then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and on every creature that moves along the ground and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat the meat that has lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. And then literally the next couple of verses, God starts saying, I'm starting with you and your family a new covenant. So you see what I mean? It's very similar, right, to Genesis chapter 1? Very similar. But what are the differences between this new commissioning and this new covenant with Noah that we didn't see in Genesis chapter 1? Well, one of them is here God tells them that they can eat the animals. That wasn't there in Genesis chapter 1 because in the beginning, in the perfection of the garden, there was no death, so you couldn't eat the animals. And here, there's a sharp condemnation for anyone who would kill another human being. This is one of the many verses from which we as Christians derive our belief in the sanctity of all human life. So even the language from God here leads us to view this moment as a form of new creation in the world. It's a fresh start with a new covenant. And though things are not as good as they were with Adam and Eve in the garden, there is once again hope for creation. But here's something else that kind of strikes me, another important element to this new setting that God makes, is that God promises that what has happened here in this story will not happen again. Regardless of how wicked the world might get, God adamantly said here, never again. Isn't that interesting? Never again. Why is that? Why did God say never again? Humanity didn't change. In fact, even in saying never again, he says, even though the inclination of human hearts is always evil all the time. Okay, humanity didn't change. You can just go home and finish reading chapter 9. It takes no time at all for humans to go off the rails again, right? So humans didn't change. The fallen state of creation didn't change. Sin was still there. So why would God change his methods? Were his methods bad? Was he wrong for doing it? Were they ineffective and a waste of time? No, I don't think we can say any of those things. So why change? I wish I'd had more time to find that answer out this week. I don't know. And there's a lot of things we don't get to know the explicit answer for. We don't get to know why God does what he does all the time, do we? Many of us here have been noticing that truth a little bit extra over the last week. We don't know why God chose to specifically use the flood in the first place. We don't know why God specifically said he'd never do it again. Personally, I think it grieved God to watch so much of his creation be destroyed. Just like he was grieved at the sin, I think he was also grieved at the final result of the sin, even if it was necessary. I think that's why one of the very first things he says to Noah when Noah steps off the boat is no more shedding of human blood. Okay? I think God felt that on a level. But I do know one reason for sure, okay? I do know one reason for sure why he said he'd never do it again. And that's because he is a graceful God. No matter how wicked we are, no matter how far we've gone, no matter how broken we might be, God is not willing to throw us away. He has chosen to be graceful to us. Even when we grieve him, even when we cause him pain, God will be gracious to you because he loves you. Because he is a father more than a tyrant. And I hope you would know that any flood that might come in your life, metaphorical flood that might come in your life, I hope you would know, or at least one day can see, that he will also provide an ark to deliver you through that crisis and to lead you on into the hope of new creation and new life and a new promise. Earlier this morning, I I said that the waters of this flood wouldn't wash away the sin of the world. I stand by that statement. But now God has chosen a new waters. And he has asked us to pass through these new waters through which he himself, not the waters, but he will transform us and clean us from all sin. That so much is said through the Old Testament and the New, that then he would place within us a new heart. And that we would never again be the people that we were, that old creation would be dead in the water and a new creation would rise. If you're here this morning and you're ready to commit yourself to the God who loves you, who is your Father, and who wants that well-being for you for eternity, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?